Welcome to the cityCURRENT radio show. I'm your host, Andrew Bartolotta. Parents, listen up. This interview is for you. We're speaking with parenting coach Allana Robinson, who has over 15 years of experience in early childhood behavior management. Allana, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Now, give listeners a history for you and your career.
So I actually started my career just as a babysitter. I had moved away from home to go to university, just like I think a lot of people have. And I was just so homesick. And I ended up babysitting for a family who have 2 kids with autism. And it completely changed my life. I was originally in school for graphic design. Within months of starting working with them, I switched everything to child development, changed my major, everything. And once I parted ways with them, I started working in early intervention with children who have special needs. And I got the opportunity to work with kids from every stripe of ability, all the way from like just typical run-of-the-mill speech delay, all the way up to one of the children that I worked with was one of 3 children in North America with his specific diagnosis. So I got to really get a wide range of experience and work with a lot of different kids and a lot of different behaviors. There's very little that a child can do anymore that surprises me. And so I did that for about 10 years. And then I went on maternity leave. I had my son and I started parent coaching because it was something that I was able to do and the way that I was able to serve that community without having to put him into care. And so I've been doing that for the last, it's coming up on 6 years now. It'll be 6 years in August. And I've been very privileged. I've been able to work with parents from all over the globe. If there's somewhere that they speak English, I have a client there. And it's just so rewarding to see parents become empowered and really become the experts on their own kids.
I love that. And you really walk alongside these parents. Now, someone might say, I'm a parent, I need a coach. What does a parent coach do? What do they offer? Can you tell our listeners some of the services you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So think of it like a basketball coach or a soccer coach. They're there to help give an outside perspective to the players and help them see what's going on the field and choose the right plays, right? So a parenting coach is exactly the same thing. I am standing on the outside of your family and I am able to help you gain some different perspectives on what's going on with your kid and help you try some different strategies that are evidence-based, that are research-based, that you can try and implement in your household to change those behaviors that are driving you up the wall. And so I do that in 2 ways. I have private coaching. So that's really appeals to parents who really like their privacy and they really just want to have those touch points, very much like a therapy session where you come and you do an hour-long session and we talk about what's going on and we make a plan for the next week. And then you go back and you implement, and then we come back and debrief and try some new things. And then I also run a program called Parentability, which is a group coaching program. And the great thing about a group coaching program is that often parents know that there's something wrong or something isn't working for them, but it's really hard to articulate what. And so the group coaching model is great because you don't just get to benefit from my expertise, but you get a whole village, we call a posse of parents to really kind of peek into what's going on in their homes and see if that might be applying to your household as well. Our motto is it used to take a village, now it takes a posse. And so it gives you that kind of connection to other parents and to tweak and troubleshoot and figure out what exactly is causing the behavior that you're seeing that is driving you up the wall. And then we have a whole bunch of different strategies to remedy that situation and really set your kids up for success in the long term.
I love that so much because many parents struggle in silos and they think, oh, I must be the only parenting dealing with my child acting out or misbehaving. And it really is, if they have that group collective impact that they can learn from each other, or they have that one-on-one session with you, but also with your knowledge base from having working with others and the experience there, you can say, oh no, this is something that I see and here's what we can do to fix that or work alongside those parameters. So that is so cool. Now, you're the host of the Mudroom podcast. Tell listeners what that is, maybe some topics they can learn from that and where they can learn more about it.
I've been doing it for about 5 years, and it's really just a short weekly talk that I do on different aspects of parenting. Sometimes we're talking about a specific study like the Pygmalion effect. Sometimes I'm talking about a theorist, like I've got a whole series on like Vygotsky and Piaget and all of those guys way back in history that really shaped how we think about children now. A lot of the time, I'm actually just answering a question that comes up in my Facebook group. So I have an episode that, oddly enough, is my most popular episode about why children self-harm. And so that was a question that came to me in my Facebook group where somebody was like, my kid is hitting themselves constantly and I don't understand why. And so I was able to kind of walk through what was going on and why this happens and some different strategies that we use to try and mitigate that. So it's a lot of information that really kind of helps parents understand why kids do what they do. And as you said, like, I take a very evidence-based approach to parenting because there's so much crap out there in the parenting space. And as a new father, I'm sure you've experienced this where
Yes.
everybody's got a freaking opinion.
Yes.
And before you know it, parents are overwhelmed and they're like, well, I don't know, like, do we co-sleep? Do we not co-sleep? What's better for them? What is actually objectively better for them? And what works, what doesn't work? The thing is, we've had so many advances in the field of child development over the last 50 years. We've had more research and studies done in the last 50 years than we did in the 500 years before. So the information that a lot of parents are working off of is really old information. We know a lot more now, just since the 90s. So it's really important, I think, that parents are considering that and that they're kind of looking at the why of things. And that's really what I aim to do with the Mudroom, is to help parents understand why their kids are doing what they're doing. Because if you know what's going on under the hood, it's so much easier to make an informed decision.
What are some top reasons kids misbehave?
Stress. 99.9% of the time, it's that they're stressed. And when I say stress, I'm not talking about worry. A lot of adults will conflate stress with worry because as adults, we spend a lot of energy worrying about things. But what stress really means is energy expenditure. What are we spending our energy on? And the way that society in general is set up for children right now is we're asking children to spend their energy on a lot more things, and we're not giving them a lot more opportunities to refill their energy tank. So when I say a child is stressed, it's that there's a demand that's placed on them that requires more energy than they have to give. I usually tell parents to think of it like a gas tank, right? Like everybody has a gas tank, and just like your car, some mornings you wake up with a full tank and some mornings not so much. And depending on what you do and how hard that is for you, you might use a lot of energy getting through your day, or you might use very little. Things like brushing our hair, brushing our teeth, making a cup of coffee. Those we do on autopilot and they take barely any energy. But then, like, an example I used when I was working with a parent group recently was, you're in the middle of getting set up to work remotely and your internet drops out. And the amount of energy and how exhausting that is, troubleshooting that and figuring out what the problem is and having to call your ISP and all that. Those are the things that they just suck so much energy because they're unexpected and we weren't planning for them. And it's this with little kids, we are constantly throwing new challenges at them without warning them about it, right? Without giving them any advance instruction, and just it's sink or swim. And so 9 times out of 10, if a child is misbehaving, it's because they're out of energy and they don't know how to get more energy in order to fulfill that demand.
Give listeners some tips for those who say they don't know how to get their child to listen.
So listening is not a single skill, contrary to popular belief. It is a combination of skills. So we have these skills called executive functioning skills. They start developing around the age of 2 and they finish developing around the age of 28. So for a lot of us, we didn't have fully developed executive functioning skills before we started having children. So executive functioning skills are like the mental tools that we use to do literally everything. And there's generally broken down into 8 categories. So flexible thinking, working memory, task initiation, impulse control, emotional control, organization, planning and prioritizing, and self-monitoring. And so we use a combination of those skills to do literally everything. So usually I'll use the example of putting on your shoes because it's just such a mundane thing. And it's something that I think most parents know the frustration of on a deep, bone deep level. So to put on your shoes, if you tell your child, okay, go put your shoes on because we're going to leave the house, they have to stop what they're doing, take their attention off of that and shift it to what you're saying. That's flexible thinking. They then have to remember where their shoes are. That's working memory. They then have to remember all of the steps to putting their shoes on. So like you have to get the shoes, you have to open them up, you have to put your foot in, hold the tongue out of the way, pull the laces tight, all of those steps to actually doing it. That's also working memory, but it's also planning and prioritizing because you can't pull the laces tight before you put your foot in or else it doesn't work. And then you have to go find your shoes, walk through all those steps, which requires self-monitoring. And then finally, so at the end of this task, this very mundane, simple task that most of us do 20 times a day, you've used almost all of those 8 skills. And if a single skill is weak, the whole chain breaks down. If a single skill requires more energy for you to use than you have, then the whole chain breaks down. So that goes back to that stress piece that I was talking about, where if the demand you put on your child requires more energy than they have to give you, they're just not going to do it because they don't have the ability to do it. So when it comes to learning to listen, it's really important that we look at what we're actually asking our child to do, look at how much energy it's requiring from them, and then try and fix that underlying problem. Very, very rarely is it that your child isn't hearing you, right? Which is, I think, what most parents think, because that's why we yell, right? If we say it louder, then they suddenly do it. And the reason for that is that when we yell at our children, we give them a spike of cortisol, right? We put them into fight or flight, and our body produces cortisol to try and keep ourselves safe. So that's why suddenly when you yell, they're suddenly able to do the task that 10 minutes before they weren't able to do, because they just got emergency energy. That's basically what cortisol is emergency energy to keep ourselves safe. So when we're teaching children to do things, we really have to break down a task. We really have to make it step-by-step instruction. We have to make sure that we give them time to do the task. Often we're asking them to do things very, very quickly because it's very quick for us. We're used to it. We're good at it. And so we're like, well, why is it taking you 20 minutes to put on your shoes when it takes 5 seconds? Well, because they're having to get the energy to do each of those steps, to use each of those skills. And so make sure that you leave lots of time and you're not rushing them. And then recognize when they kind of stall out in a task. So if your child is, you're like, hey, go put your shoes on, and they go and they get their shoes, and then they're sitting there kind of staring at their shoes, well, then you can usually diagnose from that what skill is causing the problem, right? So if they're just sitting there staring at their shoes, maybe they're having difficulty planning and prioritizing, and they can't remember what step goes first to get their foot in the shoe. So you can kind of facilitate that to get them over the hump. Again, I take a very kind of analytical approach to parenting in that way, but the nice thing about it is at first it's really clunky, but as you get used to breaking down tasks like that, it becomes very, very quick, and it's very, very easy to then constructively teach your child what to do instead of yelling at them for not knowing what to do.
Exactly. And I think that as parents, we can assume so much. Well, I know how to put my shoes on, and I know that you just learned, but you've learned, so you should know how to do it. And let's go, let's go. And we don't allow that time and that empathy for our children to realize you're in this world that is very overwhelming to us. And I can't imagine how much more overwhelming it is for you still learning all of these basic skills.
Yeah, and the way that I usually explain it is like, if I give you a dull saw and I told you to go cut down a tree, and you're like, okay, you know what to do, you know how to do it, you're willing to do it, but if you go and try and cut down a tree with a dull saw, it's going to take you all damn day, and you're going to be exhausted at the end of it, and the tree's still not going to be down. You're not going to have made a dent in it. Versus if I sharpen that saw for you, you're going to be able to fell that tree, and then move on and go and do something else with very little effort. And that's where those tools come in, right? The executive functioning tools are, or the skills are the tools that we use to do literally everything. And if we're trying to get our children to do something with a weak tool, it's going to exhaust them, and that's going to leave no energy left over for them to do anything else.
Okay, so you mentioned that you've worked with kids on the autism spectrum and many other disadvantages that they have to overcome, adversities per se. Why is inclusion so important in the schools to help them succeed?
One of the greatest assets that you can have in your child's life is a peer with a disability, because what is good for a child with a disability is good for everybody. Right? I worked in kindergarten classrooms a whole lot. And over the last 20 to 30 years, we've had something called academic creep happen to our school systems all over North America, where we've slowly moved expectations younger and younger and younger, to the point where we're now expecting young kindergarten children to be able to do math, write, read, all of these developmentally inappropriate expectations. And when you insert a child with a disability in a typical classroom and you modify the environment so that it's appropriate to them, because they can't cope with those developmentally inappropriate expectations. Typical children will try their best. They usually still fail because they're developmentally inappropriate, but they will try their best. When you have a child with a disability, they can try their best, but they're never going to reach that inappropriate expectation. So inclusion really means not just having that child there and present and doing their own thing in the same space. Inclusion means bringing somebody into an environment and then modifying the entire environment so that it's appropriate to everybody in the classroom, not just the one child, not just the typical children. So it's really, really important because, one, it makes our environments more positive, more appropriate for everybody in the environment. Two, it gives children really beautiful exposure to people who do things differently because they need to do things differently. And it really hits home that idea that different isn't dangerous, different isn't bad, it's just different. And I think everybody could really benefit from that right now. And usually when we have a child in an environment like that, where they're getting the support they need and the children are getting that exposure to somebody else getting the support that they need, it really helps to reinforce that anybody can do anything with the right support, right? Going back to the Pygmalion effect. With the right nurturing, anybody can get to where they need to be. And that's a beautiful, really affirmative model to have for young kids.
What puts a smile on your face when you look at the work that you're able to do each and every day?
There is no better feeling than seeing a parent understand their child for the first time. Like that moment when a parent is able to solve their own problem, especially after they've been coached for a while, is just magic. I want every single parent to feel like the expert on their own child that they are. Nobody knows your child better than you. You've been with them since birth. It doesn't matter what the experts say or what their teacher says or what their doctor says. You are the one that knows your child best. The only person who knows your child better than you is themselves. So when I have those moments with clients where you can see the light go on and you can see the connections being made and you can see them understanding what happened with their child or what is happening with their child, and they know how to course correct on their own, that, like, it makes me want to dance. It makes me want to dance. It puts a massive smile on my face. It makes me so happy. And I feel like if every parent could really feel like the expert on their own child that they are, then we would just have a much more inclusive, a much more accepting, a much happier society in general.
Talk about the resources people can find on your website.
Absolutely. I have just a whack load of resources on my website. I guess the main one would be my blog. And so that is basically written versions and articles of our Mudroom podcasts. Everybody learns differently, so I really try to make all of my content available in 3 formats: video, blog, and podcast. So that doesn't matter if you're an auditory learner or a visual learner or otherwise, that you are able to really engage with and get the information that you need. I also have a free workshop, which kind of breaks down the framework that I teach parents about how behavior is developed and that they can then take and apply with their kids, understanding how those skills and that stress and the critical thinking, which is something we haven't talked about yet, all kind of come together to either create good behavior or negative behavior. And then I also have my Parenting Posse Facebook group, which is my peer-to-peer community. It's moderated by a bunch of my former clients. And that's really kind of like a social hub where parents can kind of get together, talk about all of these different concepts and kind of tweak and troubleshoot and figure out what their next step is.
And tell listeners what the website, where they can go to learn more, and then also your social media handles.
So my URL is allanarobinson.com. Allana is spelled A-L-L-A-N-A. And then my social handles on Facebook, I'm at Uncommon Sense Parenting. On Instagram, I'm Parenting Posse. And you can also find me at Uncommon Sense Parenting on Pinterest as well.
What are some of your tips on discipline?
Timeouts were developed as an alternative to spanking, but both of those methods rely heavily on shame, on teaching children what not to do with the assumption that they will then do the opposite. But that's a big leap to expect a young child to make, right? So we say, like, don't hit your brother. Well, what should I do when he's in my face and grabbing my toy and I want him to get away from me, right? That's the question that your child is left with when we punish them for not knowing what to do. And then we never actually teach them what to do to handle that situation. So what I teach is something called the logical consequence process for young children. And it's kind of a discussion framework with kids to intervene, to get them to think critically about what it is that they're doing and how to resolve that problem in the future. And instead of shaming them and relying on that, don't do that, it's, this is what happened. What should we do instead of what you just did? So there's 4 steps. The first is to ask a problem-solving question. So it's like, hey, you hit your brother. How can you tell your brother to back up? And then that opens the opportunity for your child to give you a response. Most young children won't the first couple of times because they're like, well, I don't know. If I knew, I would have done it, right?
Right.
So, you're asking, okay, what could you do instead? And they're just going to stare at you at first. And you say, okay, you could say, please back up, or you can back up. Which would you like to do? And you just give them 2 very controlled choices. So they're controlled choices because either option is okay. We're not trying to trap children here. We're not trying to make them give us the right answer and kind of quiz them. We're trying to give them 2 acceptable options that they can pick from. And then we want one of those options to be something that we can actually enforce. So, because again, when they're not used to this response, they're just going to stare at you and be like, I don't know. And so you're going to give them, you can ask him to back up or you can back up. And they're just going to stare at you at first. And so then at that point, that's when you would follow through. And that's the consequence, right? Okay, I'm going to back your body up so that he's not so close to you anymore. And then that way you just pick your child up, move them back, and then you've solved the problem, right? You taught them what to do next time someone is in their face and grabbing at their toys. Back up. And it's kind of clunky at first. A lot of parents are like, this is a lot of steps. And yes, it is a lot more steps than just yelling time out. But the result is after you use this format over and over and over and over, your children start to understand that this is how we solve problems. And they start to answer those questions. You hit your brother. How can you ask him to back up? I can say back up. Great, do that. And then they're starting to solve their own problems. And then gradually those back end steps, they fall off because you're not having to walk them through the whole process anymore. You can just say, you hit your brother, and they're going to go, please back up. And you're like, great, next time do that instead of hitting him. And so your children gradually start to build those skills to think critically about what's happening to them and what they can do instead of just lashing out.
I love that critical thinking approach, because the discipline of timeout or spanking doesn't really get you anywhere when it comes to the child learning their behavior and what they need to do to not have that happen again. So that's great.
It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall, right? Like, okay, well, I'm not supposed to do this. Now I have to trial and error a bunch of different things to see what does work or what I am supposed to do. And in that process of trial and error, they're going to fail a whole lot. We can shorten that by just teaching them what to do.
And where can people go again to learn more about you and support your efforts?
AllanaRobinson.com is my website, and you can also follow me on Instagram at Parenting Posse.
Allana, thank you so much for coming on our show today.
Thank you so much for having me.